Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our webinar. My name is Tarin, and I am one of the knowledge and research leads here at the Center for Innovation in Campus Mental Health. We're joined here by Emily Donahue and Steven Bowa. We have a great webinar ahead. Before I begin, though, I want to go over some housekeeping, make sure everything's good. In the chat, I've put some of the housekeeping down, but I'm just going to go over it briefly. So we have closed captioning at the bottom of the screen. If you would like French closed captioning, just toggle on the translation the translation on, and then set your speaking language to English and your caption language to French, and then you will have your French captioning. The chat function is available for discussing thoughts and reactions. Please keep it respectful. We want to have a very safe and inclusive environment here during this webinar. And then we will have our Q&A section at the end of the webinar, so it'll be around 10 to 15 minutes. If you have any questions, please drop it in the Q&A function. This webinar is recorded, and we will be uploading our recording at the end of the day. We will have some resources available as well, so that will be uploaded on our website, and you can check those out then. So without further ado, I'm just going to turn it over to our speakers, Emily and Steven.
Hi, thanks so much. And thank you for having us today. Just by way of introductions, again, my name is Steve Bowa. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the Outreach, Education, and Communications Coordinator at Sheena's Place. I'll tell you a little bit about Sheena's Place in a couple of slides, and then I'll pass it to Emily.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. My name is Emily Donahue. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm joining from an organization called NEDIC, or the National Eating Disorder Information Center, as a community engagement facilitator and a direct client support worker. And I'll tell you a little bit more about NEDIC in a moment. To start, I think as we're embarking on a journey of learning and reflection, I think it's really important to start with a land acknowledgement and appreciate those who've taken care of this land for generations. And so I'm joining this webinar from Treaty 13, or the Dish with One Spoon territory, colonially known as Toronto, Ontario. And this land is shared and protected by the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee. And I think it's really important to start a discussion today with this acknowledgement, because when we're talking about a person's relationship with their bodies and with food and the processes for healing those relationships, we know for many Indigenous people, there are ways in which these relationships and these ways of healing have been intentionally damaged and stolen, whether that be through the processes of private land acquisition, the residential school system, and the ongoing impacts of intergenerational trauma. And I think when we talk about diet culture, it can often also end up being a conversation about health. And so I'd like us to think today, as we move through our conversation, about the many ways that health is correlated with factors like experiences of colonialism, the destruction of traditional food systems, and intergenerational trauma, and how each of these things can have powerfully negative impacts on a person's health. I think part of our mission at NEDIC involves supporting folks in achieving health, whatever that looks like in their situation. So I think we have to consider those social factors that deny health. And we know that First Nation, Inuit, and Métis voices are often left out of conversations about disordered eating and diet culture. So one commitment that NEDIC has recently made is developing resources to amplify those voices. We had the privilege to pay some folks to share a little bit about their expertise in eating disorders, whether through lived experience or professional experience. And we created a collection written for community by community. I'm going to link the one specifically for Indigenous community members in the chat if you're curious about learning more. But on this slide, we also have some further links for your learning and reading, or listening and reading, if you're curious about learning more about decolonizing the ED space.
Thanks, Emily. So today, what are we going to do? So we'll give our intros about our organizations, and there will be more information and resources available if should you need them or should you want them at the end. After that, we're just going to talk about diet culture, give a definition, and sort of delve into what it is a little bit more. Then we're going to talk a little bit about weight stigma as well, and unlearning diet culture. And then we'll talk about providing support or supporting yourselves in that journey of unlearning diet culture. Then again, at the end, we'll have some resources. So some of our objectives will just be to learn the basics about diet culture and weight stigma, identify how diet culture might show up in society, specifically in a post-secondary environment. And then we'll explore some strategies for combating diet culture and supporting people with eating disorders and their experiences of diet culture and weight stigma. So Sheena's Place, who are we? So Sheena's Place, we are a community mental health organization. We're based out of Toronto, Ontario, located in the Annex region, like Bloor and Spadina. And we provide support, so group support specifically for folks who are either affected by eating disorders, disordered eating, body image issues. We also have one group specifically for family, friends, partners, loved ones who are supporting those who are experiencing these issues. We offer a wide range of professionally facilitated groups at Sheena's Place. We offer typically anywhere from 25 to 30 workshops and groups weekly. All of our groups are free of charge. And we try to make our services as low barrier as possible. And that being said, we require no formal diagnosis or referral for folks to access our services. So if you feel you need it, or if you feel you know someone that needs it, they could join groups even as early as today or tomorrow. Yeah, I think that I'll leave it there, but if there are any questions, for sure, you can visit our website and feel free, we'll leave our emails at the end and you can send me a quick email if you want more info.
A little bit more about NEDIC, or the National Eating Disorder Information Center. We are based in Toronto, Ontario, but get to support folks from coast to coast to coast with eating disorders, disordered eating, and food and weight preoccupation. Our main service is our nationally available, anonymous and confidential telephone helpline and online live chat, available to anyone across the country who is affected by eating disorders, directly or indirectly. And we offer in-the-moment support, healthcare system navigation, and resources and referrals. We also get to deliver live customizable workshops to post-secondaries in the GTA in person and virtually Canada-wide, sort of with a goal of prevention, early intervention, and building capacity for support. But we're also a resource hub. Our website is a vast library, and so if you're curious about learning more about anything we've talked about today, or a specific concern, co-occurring condition, or intersection around eating disorders, I'd encourage you to visit our website to learn more. And so before we dive in today, I want to quickly set the space so we all feel as comfortable and safe as possible engaging in this material. I think we know that diet culture is something we've all been steeped in likely for our entire lives. And I want to acknowledge that beginning to unpack and challenge that system of beliefs that may have informed the way that we've thought and spoken about bodies and weight and food can bring up some discomfort and hesitation. And so with that being said, I'd ask you to approach this material with curiosity and openness. I think paying particular attention to some of the pieces that might be invoking a strong or intense personal reaction, because I think those can be really cool nuggets of wisdom or opportunities for further reflection. And I think if you're noticing an intense personal reaction within you, I'd encourage you to remember that feeling discomfort is distinct from feeling unsafe. I think it's okay to acknowledge these things are separate and still engage in the material through the discomfort, while taking care of yourself and protecting your safety. If at all you are feeling unsafe throughout this webinar, please feel free to step away. As Taryn said, it will be recorded, so you can always come back to this material. And if you do need further support, NEDIC's helpline is open tonight until 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So we'd like to start by kind of giving us all a collective understanding of what diet culture is and how it shows up and who it's impacting. So really, to define it, fundamentally, we think diet culture is a system of beliefs that normalizes and perpetuates body image dissatisfaction, disordered eating, and overexercise behavior. And within diet culture, things like weight stigma and fat phobia thrive in really overt and in our face ways, and more covert, sneaky ways that we'll get to talk about in a moment. But really, what diet culture does is it promotes thinness at all costs, oftentimes equating it to health and moral virtue, wherein someone is more likely to feel more or less worthy simply based on their body size. And what this does is it oppresses folks that don't fit within that narrow range of how we define health and an ideal body under diet culture. And this system of beliefs doesn't impact everyone equally. It disproportionately harms women, femmes, trans folks, people of color, people in larger bodies, and people with disabilities, damaging both their physical and mental health. And so what does this actually look like in practice? These are some examples that we see commonly showing up on campus, what diet culture looks like in a student's day-to-day life. Commonly, this can look like celebrating or demonizing certain body types. So congratulating someone on weight loss while shaming and fearing weight gain. I think the fear of the freshman 15 is something we've likely all heard of before if we get to support students on campus. Commenting on food choices, which can sometimes look like labeling foods as good and bad, or our food habit or eating habits as good and bad. Feeling the need to justify food choices by compensating with exercise or skipping a meal or restricting food intake later in the day. Another super common way that this shows up is through the diet binge cycle. And so this all really starts with this desire to regain control. And sometimes this looks like wanting to regain control about our weight or our shape, but sometimes it can be in areas where we feel out of control outside in our life. So we saw this a lot during the pandemic, but it can also show up when folks don't have consistent access to food and might be experiencing food scarcity. But really, this desire might drive a person to engage in dieting or restricting behaviors. And naturally, that's going to lead to feelings of hunger and cravings and feeling out of control around food. And I think our bodies are really smart in trying to protect us and keep us nourished. They're really old and ancient in this sense that our bodies can't really tell the difference between intentional and unintentional restriction and deprivation. So in this way, it actually codes things like famine and dieting in the same way. And so when we finally have access to food again, we're allowing ourselves to eat. This can bring upon binging and overeating behaviors, our body's very natural biological response to deprivation. This is tricky though, because it often leads to these really intense feelings of shame and guilt. I'm not good enough. I need to try harder. I don't have enough willpower. We show you these things not to shame anyone who's felt caught in these cycles before or who has dieted in the past or who is currently on a diet. I think these things are super normal to experience. And I want to emphasize that it's super understandable to feel compelled to diet, given the way that we are all so steeped in diet culture. I think especially for folks in larger bodies, it's often encouraged, if not expected, to diet, even if it's not producing any helpful results. And now, diet culture isn't just something that impacts and shapes our our behaviors individually. It's also something that's deeply embedded in the way that we've learned to think and speak about bodies and health and certain ways of eating and exercising. As I mentioned earlier, one of the ways that diet culture informs the way that we think about bodies is the way that thin bodies are often praised and valued, while fat bodies are often shamed and rejected. In this way, diet culture really paves the way for fat phobia, a harmful system of beliefs about people in larger bodies, that they are inherently unhealthier, unhappier, and lazy, which in turn really creates space for weight stigma, the systemic oppression and discrimination of folks in larger bodies, whereby they might be barred from access to healthcare or subjected to mistreatment in employment and education spaces, just to name a few examples. And when folks are subjected to weight stigma, we see an overall decrease in physical and mental well-being. And so I think at this point, we all kind of have this collective understanding that diet culture informs whose body is deemed as acceptable and valuable and whose is not based on body size. But I think it's also important to say that diet culture doesn't really exist just in a vacuum on its own. Rather, it's really working in tangent with other forms of discrimination and oppression, such as racism, white supremacy, sexism, transphobia, ableism, just to name a few. And I think when we apply this intersectional lens, we can see how diet culture and other systems of oppression can create this hierarchy of bodies wherein certain bodies are praised and glorified and others are shamed and demonized, simply based on how closely they align to this ideal body under these impossible and often oppressive standards. And so you might be thinking, well, how does this connect back to eating disorders? Why are two people from eating disorders organizations talking about this? I kind of like to think of those early diet culture signs, the examples that we showed early on of the fearing weight gain and commenting on weight and not needing to justify food choices. I kind of like to think of those as the earliest warning signs of disordered eating. Another metaphor I'll use is like, I kind of like to think of diet culture as we're all swimming in this ocean, and diet culture is the water around us. And I think most of us have an easier time treading water and staying afloat. We're subjected to these messages and pressures of diet culture, but they aren't largely impacting our mental health and our well-being. Some of us, though, no matter how hard we try to keep our heads above water, we just can't seem to stay afloat. And those messages are really being internalized and impacting the way we view ourselves and our food choices and how we exercise. All this is to say that we think everyone participates in and is subjected to diet culture, but not everyone in turn will have an eating disorder or experience disordered eating. And I think in my role as a support person, I kind of like to approach diet culture attitudes and like these signs as yellow flags or opportunities for curiosity. I might want to explore how else diet culture is informing a person's attitudes or beliefs or behaviors, and kind of try and figure out how are they staying afloat in this, and maybe do I need to offer them like a life raft or a life jacket to help them feel more confident navigating this ocean to the point where they can feel like they have more control. How can I offer some support?
All right. So now we'll shift gears and sort of with that knowledge and sort of under our collective understanding of what diet culture actually is, what it entails, and kind of how you engage in it, we will now embark on that journey of trying to unlearn it, or we'll talk about ways we can unlearn it. To frame this conversation, I think it's important that we talk about one thing, and that is, what are diet culture's core myths? So these are basic principles that folks widely accept and that really perpetuate diet culture. So smaller bodies are healthier. Weight is a simple energy in, energy out equation, and that it's possible to control one's weight and shape. These things are widely accepted as true. In many different areas of life, in many different areas of our lives and our experiences. But what are some ways that we can reframe these? So instead of saying that smaller bodies are healthier, perhaps we can talk about the fact that bodies come in a diversity of sizes and that health can exist at any of these sizes. We could talk about the fact that weight isn't simply an energy in, energy out equation, but that weight there are hundreds of factors that are responsible for weight, and most of those factors are outside of our individual control. So for instance, things like genetics, things like health conditions, things like social determinants of health, access to food, access to healthcare itself. And that the last one being that it's possible to control one's weight and shape. And maybe we can reframe this by thinking about the fact that trying to control weight is often harmful to a person's overall health. So to talk about sort of how we can maybe unpack and unlearn and reframe these things, I think it's important to talk about the history of, weight stigma and fat phobia, and really ground ourselves in why it's so problematic and how we got here. So something that we do know is that fat phobia actually has its origins in the slave trade. So with the growth of the slave trade in the 1800s, what we do know is that slave owners wanted to determine sort of different factors to differentiate themselves from slaves, specifically from other races. So they wanted to determine what appearance and behaviors should be acceptable from themselves and from other races. What they did was they created this idea that slaves, namely Black people, were sensualists, and that they, really overindulged in all things including food, all things including sex. And that's why things like the hypersexualization of Black bodies exist. And that's also why there is this inherent belief, or this was this inherent belief, that Black people were curvy. So white people, again, wanted to have a mechanism to recognize who was a slave and who was free. At the beginning of the slave trade, when things first started, skin color was used as the primary mechanism to distinguish that. But over time, with the growth of the existence of more biracial people, what they realized is that it wasn't a realistic measure anymore. And as a result, body size and eating actually became the new determinant for who should be considered a free person and who should be considered a slave. So namely, fat equals not free. And that they determined from this that white people should aim to be slender, should aim to be thinner, and watch what they eat so that they don't get curvy. Another point of history is something that we kind of all widely accept, and that's used as a tool by many medical professionals, and that being the BMI, the body mass index. So what we know about this tool, so it's a tool that's used to measure health by medical professionals. It was developed between the 1830 and 1850 by a mathematician. And essentially it was used, or it was developed as a tool for the collection of population level data. So rather than being an individual measure or an individual diagnostic tool, it was intended to be the collection of population level data. What we also know, and which is problematic in and of itself, was that this tool was developed based solely on the bodies of European males. And something else that's problematic about this tool, it was actually later then used to justify eugenics. And so it has a really problematic history, yet today we do still use it. There are other sort of factors that really convolute its use or sort of negate its use. For instance, one being, over the history and the course of its use, there have been arbitrary changes to classifications in the BMI. For instance, one example being, in 1998, the National Institutes of Health lowered overnight the overweight threshold of BMI from 27.8 to 25, which overnight in turn branded roughly 29 million Americans as being overweight. And this was simply to match international guidelines. It should also be noted that the guidelines were drafted in part by the Obesity Task Force, whose two principal funders were companies that were involved in the creation of weight loss drugs. That's just one example of sort of why it's important to understand the history of this tool and understand and frame why it maybe does not have the most reputable, the best reputation in terms of its use. Something else we know is that the body mass index has a lot of harmful impacts on specific populations, specifically Black folks and Black women in particular. So again, to reframe, the body mass index is sort of the ratio of a person's weight and height. And it was never really intended to be a measure for individual fatness or individual health, but it is. What we do know is that studies have shown that Black people tend to be healthier at heavier weights. There are vastly different experiences of an individual's body between their weight and their health profile within race. The body mass index doesn't actually account for many things, many factors, including bone density, muscularity, and cultural or genetic differences. What we do know as well is that two people can have the exact same BMI, but can have vastly different experiences and body composition. So ways that this tool is used in a harmful manner, for instance, by medical professionals, is that often when folks seek out medical help, when folks seek out referrals for procedures and surgeries, the first piece of advice, or even the first thing that they're told to even qualify for these procedures or diagnoses or surgeries, is that they need to lose weight. And some people do lose that weight, some people don't. But what we do know is that frequently, more often than not, people who do lose the weight gain it back. And overall, which we'll talk about a little bit later, we know that it's just in general harmful to tell a person to lose weight. It's harmful for their mental well-being, and it's also harmful for their physical well-being. And Emily's going to explain this in a few slides, but the overarching sort of message that we have about telling people to lose weight or focusing on a person's weight when it comes to, medical advice or anything like that, is that weight stigma itself tends to lead to worse health outcomes.
Thanks, Steve. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we move forward from here. I think part of moving forward can include changing the way that we are talking about bodies in both interpersonal and healthcare settings. I think when we get to do professional development with healthcare providers and educators and folks on campus, oftentimes this is a question that we ask them to sit with. Why do we comment on weight? Thinking about this both from a professional lens, maybe a personal lens, or a broad societal lens. And while I won't ask you to sit with this question here today, maybe it's something you can potentially take forward. I'm going to show you some of the answers that we commonly hear from folks. So we're worried about their physical health, maybe their blood pressure or their cardiovascular activity. We hope to encourage them to seek support from their healthcare provider or change their healthcare practices, like get more active. I think we hear this one from folks who get to work with kiddos, but we're worried about bullying, knowing that body-based bullying is the most common form of bullying. And so maybe we feel like we can point out the issue in a kinder way. A lot of the time, though, what I really hope this slide emphasizes is our reasons to comment on weight come from a really well-intentioned place. We're looking out for health. We want to shield them from bullying. And while they are well-intentioned, I'd really encourage us to think about the impact that comments on weight can have. Specifically looking at this from a healthcare lens, I think as Steve got to mention, diet culture and weight stigma has really deep roots in our medical system and the messages that we receive about weight and health. And so knowing this, we're mindful that it can be tricky to have conversations about eating and bodies and movement in the context of health in a mindful and disordered eating informed way. How to do this, research kind of tells us that there are real benefits from taking a weight inclusive approach to care. What this really means is trying to uncouple the complicated relationship between weight and health and trying to make space to acknowledge that there are so many other factors that play a role determining a person's health outside of weight. Unfortunately, I think weight is simply one of those factors that gets the most emphasis placed on it. And so making space to ask about a person's stress, their sleep, are they able to access nutritionally dense foods that are enjoyable and culturally relevant? Are they able to move their body in a way that makes them feel good? Do they have access to healthcare, safety, housing? All of those factors that can come together to determine a person's health. When we focus on weight or encourage a person to lose weight to treat a health condition or bar them from care based on their size, this is called weight-based discrimination or weight stigma. And based on research, we know that folks that are on the receiving end of that are impacted very negatively. We see increased risky physiological and psychological measures like increased blood pressure, blood sugar, cortisol, depression, and anxiety. We also see decreased trust in healthcare providers, which I think is the opposite of what we want for anyone that we're supporting their health. And so part of rejecting diet culture might mean exploring some different frameworks that have been created in opposition of diet culture and figuring out what resonates most with you. And so maybe you really resonate with a fat liberation approach. This is a movement that seeks to uproot societal norms that promote fat oppression and secure equity for folks of all body size. And it's really striving to change the definition of beauty and demand systemic change for bodies of all sizes. Or you might align more with a body positivity framework. I think this is something that most of us might be familiar with in the way that it's been um, popularized online and often co opted by brands, but it's kind of a movement that really believes that all bodies are beautiful and everyone should love their body. And it seeks to change the definition of beauty. Maybe, though, you find yourself really aligning with a body neutrality approach that acknowledges that body love isn't totally accessible for everyone. If we think about trans folks who might not feel like their body matches their identity, it's not totally accessible. And so, body neutrality really seeks to appreciate our body beyond its appearance. For example, appreciating the function your body serves as a vessel to help you move through the world. Ultimately, though, I'd say Steve and I are not the be all end all in rejecting diet culture. And what we hope to share with you is some pathways to kind of move forward to help you feel more empowered to make the choices of what's going to fit best within your context. Because we hope that you're going to take what resonates here and what fits for you and leave what doesn't. Fundamentally, though, whichever framework you're resonating with, we think there's kind of some core principles that all of these frameworks shared that can be applied in our work with students on campus. And so the first one being, we want to acknowledge that a person's health and risk level and quality of life can't be assumed solely based on a number on a scale. We need to consider all of those other factors and make space to ask questions about them. The second is that body weight is determined by a complex set of genetic, metabolic, sociocultural, physical, and behavioral determinants, and some of these are outside of a person's control and can't change. It involves recognizing that bodies have always come in a variety of shapes and sizes, and so it's not really reasonable for us to expect the majority of people to maintain and attain a body weight within this small range that we've deemed as ideal in this current moment. And lastly, as that slide with the clipboard explained a couple slides ago, individuals of all shapes and sizes can take benefit from interventions that help them take charge of their thoughts and their feelings and their decisions, which ultimately lead to well-being regardless of weight. In practice, though, what does this look like? I think more tangibly, we can think about what our built environment looks like and how that can foster weight inclusivity on campus or for folks that are interacting with students at like a community organization. Part of it can look like advocating for spaces that are accessible for all bodies. So thinking about your waiting rooms or your common areas or your offices, do you have wide seating without armrests for folks in larger bodies to comfortably access? Do you have furniture that's spaced out for folks using wheelchairs or mobility aids? I think you can also consider the messages and materials you have on campus for health promotions. Are they informed by diet culture or have a real focus on weight loss? Or they may be defining health in a more broad, fulsome sense. Are they reflective of diverse bodies or maybe limited to those who are really only deemed healthy through the lens of diet culture? And I think if you're answering yes to some of these health promotion questions, NEDIC is a great place to start in exploring resources for weight inclusivity around campus. And I'm happy to brainstorm what that can look like for folks if they're curious. But I'm going to toss it back to Steve here to talk about what this can look like more interpersonally.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. So yeah, we were talking about sort of the ways in which we ourselves can both unlearn and then maybe aim to change the impact of diet culture on day-to-day life. Some of these things we've sort of mentioned it on a more systemic level, or even when talking about building practices and such. But what are things that we can do in the day-to-day to really eliminate that at the presence of diet culture in our everyday life? And really, one thing to note about this and these upcoming slides is that it is an everyday practice. These things aren't going to change immediately. We're going to have to be engaging in this practice constantly. And that's okay. You know, sometimes we'll stumble, sometimes we'll fall. But as long as we're thinking about these things and considering them, that's really the best approach we can take. So what's one thing that we can do? Let's start with reflecting on our beliefs and biases about weight and health. So one way we can do this is by taking some of the tools that we provided you today and learning more about things like weight stigma and learning more about frameworks like health at every size or body liberation or body positivity or body neutrality. Those will go a long way in sort of grounding you in your understanding of why these things are harmful, and then also giving you some tools and tactics to combat them. What are some tactics we can do, tangible things we can do right now? So one is asking yourself some hard questions, and they will be difficult questions. One being, do I make assumptions about others or myself based on size and weight? And, you know, we might sit here and I might sit here and think, I don't think I do. But the more we think about it and the more we, let's think about many of our interactions throughout the day and we have a really critical lens. There are probably times when we do cast judgments about ourselves and about other people. What about, am I more likely to be friends or friendly with folks of certain body types? That's a difficult one to answer, but it is something that's interesting to think about. And then what does a person's health say to me, to you, about their worth as a human being? Oops. We can notice how we talk about food. This is something that's very common in day-to-day life. We kind of talked about these things when we were talking about the existence of diet culture or the definition of diet culture, but let's talk about them again. So perhaps we can avoid things like dichotomizing food as good or bad. We can avoid justifying on food choices. And remember that slide that sort of gave a bunch of different examples of how diet culture can show up in a post-secondary setting or in society at large, really taking a lot of those concepts and doing the opposite. So instead of doing any of these things, we can maybe value or emphasize the value of emotional, social, and cultural importance of food. There are so many reasons why we engage in and reasons why and ways we engage with food. And they're not strictly tied to diet culture. So, talking about the emotional sense, a lot of people really shy away from or cast a negative light on the term emotional eating. And of course, to a certain extent, there can be a line that we cross where it can become harmful to a person's physical and mental health. But what are ways that we engage in emotional eating that aren't, and that often are overlooked? One example that I like to mention is, eating birthday cake on your birthday. That's a form of emotional eating, something that we all do, and it's something that a lot of people do, sorry, I should say, and that a lot of people get a lot of joy from. And I think it's really important to think about the ways that, the emotional or the cultural ways that food brings us joy, rather than putting those value judgments on it and saying, eating this type of food is bad. Oh, it's bad food. It's junk food. It's this food, that food. And just really bringing it back to why we do it and why it might bring us joy. Another thing we can do is learn about concepts like flexible or intuitive eating. These are things that have helped a lot of people engage in food in a low pressure way, perhaps, or in a lower pressure way that can really take away those elements of diet culture from engaging in food on a day-to-day basis. Something else that we can do, and I think that this is something that is highly prevalent in many environments, can be very prevalent in environments where groups of people gather. So for instance, post-secondary environments, and interact on a day-to-day basis. So one thing that a lot of people do is talk about bodies in a very specific way. How can we really take the pressure off of bodies in this sense. So something we can do is avoid complimenting weight loss. We can avoid talking about weight in general as well, maybe taking it back to or taking it away from appearance as much as possible, but really commenting on weight loss is a big one. We can avoid criticizing our own bodies and criticizing other people's bodies. Maybe instead of doing these things, we can try complimenting different things about a person. For instance, personality, specific traits that you value in that person, perhaps achievements, just in general, things that really take the focus off of bodies. We can also really reflect on the purpose of the comment. What purpose does commenting on a person's weight loss or weight gain, for that matter, or weight and appearance in general? What is the purpose of it? Why are we asking that question? Why are we telling them, making this comment? And if we realize that perhaps it doesn't serve a purpose other than, either perpetuating diet culture or maybe reflecting inward and realizing why we might be saying it for ourselves, then maybe we leave the comment. And then lastly, one thing that we can do is challenge the idea of labeling fat as an emotion. So a really, really common statement that people make is that they're feeling fat, that they feel fat. And it's simply, it really is an incorrect use of the word. We don't want to attribute this physical characteristic that people are trying really hard to reclaim and make use of in a way that makes them feel okay in their body, and attaching this emotion to it, which is something that is just so common. And it might be one of those fleeting comments that we don't like to think about. But again, this is what we're going to do, is engage in thought about, the purpose of comments, or why we're saying things, or how it could be harmful to another person. So on the right, you see just a list of some non-physical compliments that these are some good ones. So talking about how you learn from someone, how someone teaches you things constantly. That's a really great, that will give someone a really great feeling and really takes the pressure off of what they're looking like. If you want to talk about beauty, you could say the way you treat people is beautiful. You can go through this list, but there's just so many different ways you can give someone a compliment or make someone feel good that doesn't derive from their physical appearance. And lastly, I really like this image, this graphic. It kind of explains why the ways talking about someone's weight loss might be harmful. It might be the most well-intentioned comment, and you might be saying, "Oh, you're looking good," or whatever the reason behind it might be. But telling someone that they lost weight, you don't really understand all of the reasons why that could be. And this is just a list of some of the reasons why someone might have lost weight that you don't know, that's actually making them feel worse about themselves. So one example is that they're relapsing from their eating disorder. Another example is that, they're experiencing food insecurity and that they can't find food or can't afford to buy food. There's another one, autoimmune disorders often will lead to a fluctuation of weight. So one is, I got lupus and my body is fighting itself and I can't prevent my weight loss. So you just really never know what's going on behind the scenes with a person when you're giving them what you think is a positive comment. So really staying away from talking about the person's body might be the best thing in that situation. Okay. That is all of the information we have, but as previously mentioned, we do have a few slides of resources that we can share with you folks. But I might pass it back to Taryn, and I think that we'll have a Q&A period at this point.
Yes, that is what we're going to do. Thanks so much, Emily and Steven. This is great information. Folks, if you have any questions, you're welcome to put it in our Q&A function. In the meantime, maybe I can ask both of you a question. So, you provide some great advice and recommendations on sort of rethinking what dieting is or what diet culture is. And, a lot of the things we tend to, these are all learned behaviors, right? We're not born thinking that is bad. We learn this as we grow up. And, I think, what do you have any recommendations when it comes to compassionately um, pushing back when you hear these things among your friends or your colleagues or your mentors or so on? What are some strategies that you would recommend?
Such a good question. I think there are a couple ways I like to do this. I think I'll acknowledge first, like doing this is really tough. I think, especially in spaces like workplaces, with colleagues, with other professionals, or even with family, when like relationship dynamics can get a little bit dicey. I think sometimes I will just walk away from the conversation. Like, I'm not interested in engaging in this right now. Is this really the time and place for diet talk? Like, is this work meeting, is this family dinner, is this, social gathering the place for this? I think if I'm feeling a little bit spicier, I might say, that's a really interesting comment. Do you want to tell me more about that? And really have the person sit in the discomfort, kind of throw it back at them, if I'm feeling a little bit spicy.
Yeah, a lot of the time I would say the same. Um, One of my favorite things to do is ask questions, just like why? Oh, that's an interesting one. Why would you say that? Or what's the reason behind saying that? A lot of the time, if it's one of those fleeting comments that people make that's just so inherent in them, they won't actually have an explanation, which forces them to sort of critically think about why they said the comment or why they're they're making that statement, you know? Um, but I do acknowledge, like, as Emily said, it can be really tough. So I think it's perfectly okay to really disengage. Something that I might, if I really want them to know that I'm disengaging because of that reason, I'll say, I really don't like talking about, or I don't like these kinds of comments, or I don't like talking about this kind of thing, and then removing yourself, which would also cause more discussion. Oh, why did they leave? What caused them? Why was there such a strong reaction towards what this conversation was, or whatever I said? And hopefully that can lead to some thinking, some thought, some learning.
For sure. Thanks so much for that thoughtful response. Um, I guess another question, with the work you have had with students and, um, do you have any insight on how social media has an influence on some of these ideologies? How pop culture has an influence on some of these, topics and thinkings, and how bodies trend, if you could say. Do you have any, I guess, comment on that?
Yeah, I think it's something we see quite often. Um, a couple last month, Steve and I were actually at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and we got to talk with a lot of students about some of the like body-based social media trends, like fitness culture, gym culture, TikTok workout trends, what I eat in a day, and like how that really makes people feel. And I think in some ways we can disengage, like um, trying to curate your feed in a way that's going to be avoiding some of these things. I know TikTok and Instagram, and a couple other platforms have features where you can block certain terms like dieting, like weight loss, like eating disorder, if that's going to be really triggering. And sometimes those things aren't avoidable. So, like, having a plan for, like, what am I going to do if I see something that's activating and I need to take a bit of a break? How can I get support? Can I reach out to a friend? Can I attend a Sheena's support group? Can I reach out to NEDIC's helpline? Because I think we can't expect young people to disengage from social media completely. So how can we create safer social media usage for folks?
For sure. Stephen, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, I would just say kind of curating the environment that you aim to see. Something that I guess an interesting insight for me is, having personal social media and then running the Sheena Space social media, you really see how different two experiences can be. And, it really is based on what you engage with and what you accept and what you invite in. Obviously, there are certain things that are pushed on us, and as Emily mentioned, there's ways of reporting or sort of trying to steer away from those things. But really, it's an algorithm at the end of the day, and it really does want to tap into what it thinks you want to see. And because diet culture is so pervasive, because it is something that we engage with so regularly, we might not even realize how often we engage in diet culture, which can negatively skew or affect our algorithm. So really fighting back as much as you can against things that you don't want to see. We do kind of have a choice in a sense of what we engage with. It can be hard though. And as I mentioned with the idea of sort of those strategies for ditching diet culture, it's a constant practice. Sometimes it can feel exhausting, like you're fighting an uphill battle. But at the end of the day, there is a world where you do feel a little bit better based on what you're consuming. And it will just kind of be a practice.
Absolutely. And I guess, Stephen, you touched on it, and Emily, you touched on it as well, that, there's a lot of things out there that are sort of disguised as like healthy or as a fitness thing. And sometimes it's tough to figure out what's well-intentioned and what can be harmful. Do you have any tips on sort of figuring that out?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say always be skeptical, right?
Yeah.
Again, always thinking about the reasons behind things. So an experience I had was someone mentioned, oh, at my workplace uh we had like salad Fridays. And I was like, oh, like that's interesting. Tell me more. What like why that specifically? And I tried to get to the root of why it was salad Fridays. Luckily, it wasn't actually steeped in diet culture. They switched the food up and they kind of as a workplace decided different things, and it just happened to land on like different salad ingredients, which is totally okay, right? It can be innocuous or it can be harmful, but really questioning why, oh, why is it that you decided this, and having people answer that question for themselves and think and reflect on those choices sometimes can be helpful for you to frame those things, but it can also be helpful for them, if maybe in recognizing or realizing, oh, maybe they have a lingering thought that this felt a little bit problematic, or like I didn't feel so comfortable with this. Someone has affirmed why I felt uncomfortable about it. So maybe I can now do something about it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. Yeah. Emily, do you have anything to add or?
I think the only thing I'll add there is I think Steve got to share a little bit about some of those core diet culture myths. And I think like the guise that diet culture often falls under, like the different diet trends or like ideal body trends changes as we move through the years and the decades. It's going to look different. But I think if we dig down, those core messages are always present. The smaller bodies are healthier. We can control our body weight. Simple lifestyle changes, energy in, energy out. And I think if we really dig down and try and think like what's at the core of this, what is this trend, what is this habit trying to tell me about myself or the way I should be eating or moving or looking, I think if we're noticing some of those core myths, it's kind of a sign for me, this is informed by diet culture.
Right. Absolutely. I do see a couple of questions here. So we have one question asking, I'm curious about data on barriers to accessing support, and if there are different rates along the lines of gender, race, sexuality, or other identities, how can we work to remove these barriers?
Yeah. There is definitely data to support both the idea that there are certain populations that don't access support or lack access support. But what I would say is that the data that suggests that there are, monumental differences in between who experiences, let's say, disordered eating and eating disorders, that it doesn't show what you would think that it does. One example is that BIPOC folks and Black folks specifically often experience eating disorders at a higher rate, specifically binge eating, but actually access support and get diagnoses less, right? So the data itself is a bit skewed. What I would say is how can we remove barriers to accessing support when it comes to all of the different populations, especially underserved populations? For me personally, I would say really knowledge, and I aim to do this in my work. It's outreach. It's letting people know this information. Some people might not know that there are services that are there for them, or that maybe that some people might not even think that they could or that they do have an eating disorder, right? So giving people that knowledge, giving people resources to understand what they're experiencing is one really good way of maybe increasing or decreasing that barrier to support. And then again, just having as many culturally or socially relevant services as possible. So if there is a specific intersection for an experience, having for that person to have somewhere to go to talk about that specific intersection is so important. And that's something that we try to do at Sheena's Place. We have what we call demographic specific groups. So we have a group for BIPOC folk, we have a group for trans, non-binary and gender questioning folk, we have a group for disabled and chronically ill folk, and people kind of find their way to services through those. And then once they realize that they're not alone in their experience, that's when they can sort of expand into any other service. I don't know if that answers your question fully, but I'll let Emily talk a little bit more.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a whole lot else to add. I think really honing in on what Steve said about finding ways to expand existing services comforts in getting to support diverse communities, whether that be BIPOC folks, whether that be gender diverse or sexually diverse folks, so that we can build upon the systems that we already have and helping folks get connected with things that feel a little bit lower barrier. So things that don't require a referral or diagnosis if we know that BIPOC folks or queer folks are less likely to be able to access or diagnoses or like paid for services. So things like free virtual supports, peer support. How can we really lean on transformative systems that are often lower barrier than what I would call like our traditional treatment model?
Thanks so much. Final question. When you're talking to people struggling with disordered eating and the topic of controlling food, diet, exercise comes up, how do you help them to find a sense of control in other aspects of their life? Or do you push back against the need for control? This may be beyond scope, but I think it's interesting / important to think about.
Yeah, really interesting question, Avery. I think, at least in my work in getting to support folks on our helpline and live chat, I think it's really about expanding on other areas where they can feel like they can access that control. Because I think if we're able to identify even just one area, say that be school or their job or their friends or a hobby that they feel like they can have control over, I think having one space that's kind of pushing back against that makes a world of difference. And so trying to find opportunities to identify where they can feel more control outside of food and exercise, I think can make a world of difference. And then we can build up from there.
Hmm.
Anything else to add, Steve?
Yeah, I don't have a ton to add. I guess I would just say it really doesn't depend on, the individual's journey. When we talk about eating disorders and disordered eating, recovery is kind of a spectrum, so to speak, and people kind of fall anywhere along that. So someone could be in recovery but still accessing supports. Someone could consider themselves fully recovered but still accessing supports. So I think it's important to sort of know where that person's at and how they are feeling in that moment in order to decide whether or not you are able to sort of push back or how hard you can push back against those messages, versus really just trying to positively reinforce those other aspects of their lives. But both can be helpful and both can be helpful at different times. That's all I would say.
Thanks so much. Considering we're at a little past 2, we will wrap up now. I did put our next webinar that is coming up onto the chat. You can find it on our website, and this will be about understanding the needs of Indigenous post-secondary students on Ontario campuses, and it will be on November 25th at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you would like to see our webinar, other webinars that we've done, you can go to our website as well. And this is where we'll have our recording up by the end of the day. I also do want to remind folks that there will be a survey at the end. Once you exit this webinar, we will ask how you liked it. If you have any thoughts, please let us know, because this is all very important information. And I would like to know, I'm sure Emily and Steven would like to know if if people found this useful. So thanks again, everyone. Thank you so much, Emily and Steven. This has been very, very valuable for all of us. And I hope that people took away some really important things out of this.
Yeah, thank you again for having us. It's been a really great discussion.
Absolutely. And Emily and Steven, would you, if people want to reach you, what's the best way to reach you?
Yeah, should I type
Yeah.
my send payments?
Yeah, and I'll do the same.
Yes, so that's my email for anyone who might want to get in touch with me, whether that be about accessing Sheena Space Services itself, whether that be questions about the presentation, and whether that be about, booking a presentation. I don't know what the makeup of the room is, but if there is ever a specific intersection, we've gone to like clubs and things like that to give presentations to people if they felt that it was valued. So really don't hesitate to reach out.
Yeah, same thing here. I lead our post-secondary initiative with campuses all across Canada. And so if you have any questions about bringing some of NEDIC's resources to your campus or even your community organization, if you get to support post-secondary students, I'm always happy to chat.
Amazing. Thanks so much. Okay, folks, we will wrap up now, and I hope to see you at the next webinar. Emily and Steven, thank you again, and we'll see you around.
Thanks so much.